My name is Alice Copeland, and I'm the Policy and Parliamentary Affairs Manager at the Foreign Policy Centre. And I'll be chairing this discussion looking at the Middle East in 2025. We are joined by four excellent speakers this afternoon to help us unpack what's happening in the Middle East at this time and reflect on how we might be moving forward in the future. So, firstly, we're joined by Professor Simon Mabon, who is the Chair in International Politics at Lancaster University, where he also directs the SEPAD project and the Richardson Institute. We're also joined by Dr. Lina Khatib. She's an Associate Fellow at the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House and is also a visiting scholar with the Harvard Kennedy School's Middle East Initiative. Iyad Al-Rafai is a lecturer in the Department of Political Science at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, and he heads the Middle East Studies Unit at the Centre of Arab Eurasian Studies. He is also a Fellow at the SEPAD project. Finally, we're joined by Professor Clive Jones, who is a Professor of Regional Security at Durham University and Director of the Institute for Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at Durham University. We've only got sort of an hour, and I want to get right into our discussion. But first of all, just to go over some very simple sort of logistics. Each speaker will provide us with some opening insights before we move to an audience Q&A. There is a Q&A box which you'll be able to insert questions, so please do share any questions you have throughout the discussion, and I'll get to them when we move to our Q&A section. I'd also just like to highlight that we are recording this session and it will be available to watch afterwards. I'm keen. We've got a lot to discuss and not much time. So, Dr. Lina Khatib, if I could turn to you first. We're having this event at a time of profound change in the Middle East. You have a vast array of experience in the region and, most recently wrote for Time about Iran's isolation in the Middle East. I was wondering if you could give us an overview and assessment of where things stand today, accounting for the conflict that erupted between Israel and Iran recently. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, SEPAD and everyone for hosting me. This is a historic time, actually, for the Middle East. The battle between Iran and Israel actually has been going on for almost 5 decades, but this time it took a very different form, which is direct military confrontation with the US entering the equation. So we have to understand that this is not something that is in any way surprising, frankly. After October 7, 2023, the horrific attack by Hamas, the status quo that Israel had been living with and thought was a contained threat scenario no longer became sustainable for Israel or for the United States. And this is where we are now, partly as a result of the trajectory of events sparked by that attack. But as I said, in a way, this was going to come one way or another for as long as Iran was allowed to just act with impunity in this region. And various US administrations had compartmentalized the US approach to Iran over the decades by separating, for example, the nuclear file from other issues that Iran was involved in, which were all destabilizing. And focusing on the nuclear issue meant that the ballistic missile program and Iran's interventions in the region were not really addressed. These were considered issues that were relatively contained, that the region could live with. In my view, this was an erroneous assessment and led Iran to have a bigger ego, thinking through its proxies and through its missile program and through, to be honest, wasting the international community's time with negotiations on the nuclear issue, while Iran, in my view, never intended to abandon uranium enrichment. All of this, I think, led us to this moment. So now we are seeing a radical shift in the region. We've reached this pinnacle of Iran's destabilization, and now, the slope is heading downwards. And what we're seeing is, first of all, fundamentally, an eradication of Iran's self-styled axis of resistance, as Iran likes to call it, which is basically the network of proxies that Iran had in the region. A key moment, of course, was the ousting of the Assad regime in Damascus in 2024. And now with the proxies having been largely weakened, Israel and the US could turn to what I call the head of the octopus, which is Iran itself, weakening that so that the overall picture is one in which Iran is no longer the most powerful destabilizing actor in the Middle East. And this is a fundamental shift because we'd had almost 5 decades of a very different status quo. And this, for me, is a positive development regarding regional security in the region, because it paves the way for new security arrangements, both within Arab countries and also at a later stage with Israel. And also, a crucial thing is that Iran, with its adventurism, has, which is the Time article that you referred to, that I wrote, has ultimately resulted in self-inflicted isolation for the Tehran regime. And therefore, we have, again, beyond the regional picture, an international geopolitical picture in which these illusions about Iran being in one camp with Russia and China has proven not to be an accurate assessment of international power dynamics. So Iran is isolated. The axis is basically on its way out. The regime in Iran has never been weaker. This allows an opportunity for peace. And another thing that I wrote about is how Iran is the last lifeline for Islamism in the region. And I wrote this piece in Foreign Policy if anyone wants to look at it. But basically what I'm saying is, right now, the only big political patron of Islamism, both Sunni and Shia, in the Middle East is actually the Iranian regime. And so if the Iranian regime is weakened, we also have this other fundamental shift in power dynamics in the region further down the line. So I think this is a monumental era that we are witnessing and living in. And I just hope the international community takes advantage of the opportunities that this change brings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lena, for providing that really, helpful introduction and also highlighting the significance of this moment in the region. If I could turn next to you, Iyad, Lena, you mentioned the role of international actors, and I think we'll definitely touch on that, in other comments and throughout the Q&A. But Iyad, we've discussed the kind of developments in the region, but I wondered if you could provide some insights into the role of Gulf countries at this time. How are GCC countries assessing the current situation in the region, particularly following Iran's attack on Qatar, but also, in particular, thinking about your role, what role is Saudi Arabia playing at this time? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Alice, for the invitation. And thanks a lot also for Lena for such illuminating points that she provided to us. Firstly, I think there is the main concern from the GCC countries is the missing vision from the West. So what we have been saying since 2014 is that Iran is a dangerous player in the region. There is a threat from Iranian affiliated militia, etc. However, we did not find an audience in the West. I'm talking about Western politicians that really wanted to heed those advices. What we have seen since October the 7th, 2023, is that Western politicians are adopting the same line the GCC countries provided in 2015, which is 10 years late from the vision of the GCC countries. As you know, with the GCC countries since 2022 established new relations with Iran, and it's been not the very best of a journey, but however, they are, managing their differences diplomatically and also when it comes to economic issues. We haven't seen much attacks from the Houthi militias since 2023 in Saudi Arabia. We haven't seen much of Iranian interference in domestic issues in GCC countries, but larger in Arab countries. And that can be seen in Syria, whereby Iran really did not help al-Assad to continue ruling Syria. So it's contradictory to see different policies in different times. We are not asking the West, I mean, politicians in the region are not asking the West to follow their advices. However, it's interesting to see the shift from Western politicians who in 2015, 2018 said to us, you have to rationalize your approach towards Iran. You have to go to the table, negotiate with Houthis, negotiate with different Islamist players in the Middle East. But right now they are shifting the narrative. Unfortunately, they are not shifting the narrative because of their regional approach or they have a regional vision, strategic one. Unfortunately, all changed post 2023, post October the 7th, 2023. And this shift is really advised by mostly Israeli concerns from Iran. It is not really advised by regional concerns. There is no regional vision provided by Western countries to the Middle East. What we are seeing is only tactical vision. They want to fight adversaries in the Middle East. However, they don't have a project really, an economic project or a socio-economic sustainable project to the Middle East. And this is unfortunate. The only project that we've seen, especially from the United States since the collapse of the or the end of the Cold War, is preaching democracy and human rights. However, we've seen the total opposite since 2023. There is no human rights in what Israel is doing in Gaza. There is not really democracy in the Israeli rule of Benjamin Netanyahu right now. So this really leads us to a point of regional uncertainty, global uncertainty. There is no clear vision of Western allies, if they are really allies to GCC countries or just friends or friends with benefits or without such. It's really an interesting timing that we see ourselves in. And I'm telling you, there is not much credibility for Western politicians all over the region. I mean, I read an article written by Prince Turki Al Faisal 2 days ago, where he promised not to visit the US unless Trump leaves office. And it was interesting take by someone who has been in the elite position of Saudi ruling elite since the 1960s. He really lashed against Western hypocrisy, as he named it. This really is not helpful to GCC countries who are looking to achieve their visions, their regional and domestic visions, which are based on socioeconomic developments, based on investments coming from China, from the West. The regional atmosphere right now, led by Israel, is not helping anyone in the region to achieve any of their plans, be it domestic, regional, or international. It's only helping the ruling elite within Israel. And it's unfortunate to see the West falling in the trap of that ruling elite. That is the vision in general from the GCC countries.
Thank you, Iyad, for providing that sort of, overview of what the perspective is in GCC countries at this time. And I think be great if we can touch further, in the Q&A, and I would ask anyone if they do have questions to please put them in and we can come to them later. But, some of what one sort of alternative vision from the GCC could be as well. But I think what you've said really leads in nicely to comments that we'll hear from Clive. We've touched on an array of issues, but I'd be very interested with your background to have if you could share some insights on the domestic situation in Israel and what calculations are being made by Israel with relation to Gaza, but also, broader regional security and Iran. This is particularly relevant, obviously, with the news that's coming out this morning and last night around a ceasefire led by the US. Thanks, Clive.
Well, thank you, Alex, and thank you to SEPAD and to the Foreign Policy Centre for allowing me to address you today. I start off by saying, actually, we don't really know what the new order that seems to be, or people want to emerge from the Middle East, looks like. I mean, it reminds me of Antonio Gramsci's famous phrase when he said that the old is dying, but the new is yet to be born. And I think we are in that process right now. No one quite knows what this new order is going to look like. And that includes Israel. I mean, I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that Netanyahu, from being at the nadir of his political career, many people were already writing his political obituary. in the aftermath of October the 7th, has now resurrected a political career which clearly seemed doomed after October the 7th. I think very much he sees his mission now as casting a new regional security order with Israel at its very apex. And I think what's worth noting is that when Trump announced before the world that the Americans had joined in the bombing of the Iranian nuclear program, look what Netanyahu said. He said, first comes security, and then comes peace. That is the order of priorities now for Israel. And Netanyahu is very, very quick to look at the achievements of Israel. First of all, it's clearly the dismembering, the dismantlement of the axis of resistance. I won't go into details, this will come up in the Q&A. But what I would say of the so-called axis of resistance, it's only really the Houthis now who are still actively in trying to engage Israel. And even there, I think the capabilities have been actually much diminished. Secondly, the Israelis will also point to the fact that despite worldwide condemnations of its actions in Gaza and the appalling death toll amongst the Palestinians, actually the Abraham Accords, symbolically at least, remain intact. No signatory from the Abraham Accords or to the Abraham Accords has actually walked away. But, and I think this is a clear an important point. I think the Israelis now see the Abraham Accords entirely differently to how they regarded them back before October the 7th. The original idea behind the Abraham Accords was clearly a security partnership, which is going to be underscored by economic ties. And that was in some respects an agreed sense of regionalism that was beginning to emerge across the Middle East. It was also about clearly containing Iran in the face of what many perceive to be the retrenchment of the United States. But this is no longer the case itself. Israel has now demonstrated clearly a military reach, a capability and intent by itself in its attacks on Iran. It, in fact, does not need the Emiratis or indeed, if ever, the Saudis were to have joined. It sees I think it sees now the Abraham Accords as a mechanism to reorder the region with Israel as its primary hegemon. And there's no doubt that I think that some in the Gulf clearly welcome the degrading of Iran's nuclear military capabilities, but they very much saw the Abraham Accords as a partnership in which Israel's actions could be constrained. I think now they're going to be disappointed by that, and they'll be worried too for the reasons Ayad has just pointed out. And this brings me to a third key point. I think that Israel's appetite for risk has increased exponentially. And as I've noted previously, I think what Israel is now beginning to do is reshape unilaterally the security arrangements adjacent to its borders. And where once it was seen as a status quo power, I think Israel is now increasingly becoming a revisionist power. And I think that most political and security elites in Israel, although there is some disagreement with this, but I think increasingly this is something that is now being accepted within Israel itself. And certainly one, I think, that enjoys popular approbation amongst a population which is still traumatized by the events of October the 7th. We can come to talk about the relationship with the United States perhaps in the Q&A, but where does this now leave Israel and Israelis, which is, I think, Alice, you really wanted me to address. Well, there are reports that Netanyahu is considering calling early polls, but I think he will be wary of the fact that as much as the Likud, his party, has been buoyed by the strikes on Iran, actually it seems to be support within the right-wing bloc in Israel that makes this coalition government, which is going over to the Likud rather than capturing ground from the center and certainly not from the left itself. So I think he might be wary about calling immediate early elections, although that cannot clearly be ruled out. Israel, however, remains a deeply divided society. Netanyahu, he's still blamed for ignoring the hostages and indeed prolonging the war in Gaza for his own political benefit and effectively to stall the ongoing trial that he's facing on 3 counts of corruption. But there may be a calculation that is coming to pretty quickly, particularly if it's true that Israel has agreed to a 60-day ceasefire deal through the United States, the Qataris, and the Egyptians, that effectively he can perhaps do without Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, 2 key coalition partners, if he feels that he can carry the rest of the Knesset with him. And certainly I think his position's been strengthened by the inclusion of Gideon Saar into his cabinet. So that may be a risk he's calculated he can actually take. I think as well we need to look at the changed relationship that Netanyahu now actually has with his own military. It's always been almost an article of faith that Netanyahu rubbed up against resistance from the military. This goes back to 1999, but he's always seen the old military as being part and parcel of the old statist elite whose allegiance was always to the centre left, to the old Labour Party. I think that's changed. I think the military now, the character of the Israeli military has changed. Clearly, it in and of itself looks at its performance on October the 7th, and there's a great deal of soul searching that's taken place. But just as importantly, the social character of the IDF has changed. You have more religious nationalist officers in positions of leadership, and I think that sense of mission, that religious nationalist mission, is increasingly feeding through to the IDF. My broader point being is I think that to a certain extent, Netanyahu now has a far more pliant military. Where does that leave the opposition in Israel? Well, the opposition in Israel for a long time has been fragmented. Ever since the turn of the century, there has been this gravitation, I think, of Israeli public opinion more and more to the right, and increasing opposition to Netanyahu is fragmented. Partly this explains why you have this continuous attack of his government against what they regard as the deep state. It's a term I detest, but nonetheless, this notion of the deep state, which seems to oppose Netanyahu and his government at every step, hence the so-called judicial reform, which prompted these mass protests which were on the streets prior to October the 7th. I was in Israel actually just 3 weeks before those attacks took place, and I spoke to at least 3 senior Israeli security officials, two of them retired, but each one of them said to me without prompting that if this carries on, they being the mass protests against the judicial coup, there will be civil war in Israel. And for many, that is actually still an issue. Violence on the street, Jew against Jew. And we shouldn't underestimate that as a calculus in how people think and act in Israeli politics today. So I think to a certain extent, we're now reaching, as it were, a real Rubicon that will soon be crossed. Netanyahu will have to decide whether he's going to take a political risk, go for a ceasefire deal in Gaza, and perhaps then push for early elections. He may feel with the attack on Iran and with the strategic situation in the region far more benign to Israel than it was 18 months ago. This is a risk that he's now willing to take. And with the United States on board, he may well do so. And I'll leave it there, Alice.
Thank you, Clive. That was, a really fantastic summary and insight into some of the different points of thinking within Israel and the dynamics that are happening on the domestic level too. Simon, I'd like to turn to you as our last speaker for the fun bit. I think, based on all of these comments we've had, Lena's really highlighted how things have changed, and this is a really significant moment in the relationship between Iran and Israel, but what that means more broadly. And Iyad, you discussed how what have often been seen as kind of traditional actors in the region are being viewed entirely differently in the GCC, and by countries that are taking a new sort of, or not new, but a different leadership role. And Clive, you also highlighted how what had been seen as a huge shift with the Abraham Accords are viewed differently, and Israel's behavior is bolder and more willing to take risk. It feels like there's many different sort of, crossing turning points where the future's unclear, but what is clear is that things are going to be different. And Simon, I'll then turn to you with the kind of fun question of kind of reflecting a bit on what do you think has changed and where do you think we could be going at? If you could provide some of those sort of broader reflections before we then move to the participant Q&A. And I'll just highlight again, I have lots of questions, but I'd like to make sure that the questions from the audience are prioritized. So please do put in any questions that you have now, and we'll come to them for the sort of latter half of this section once we've heard from Simon. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. Thank you, Clive, Iyad, Lena, everyone at the Foreign Policy Centre. It's been fascinating to hear all of your insights. Although I must express my frustration with you, Clive. Apologies. But I'd written down that Gramsci quote as well. So I'm a little frustrated that it has been used already, because I think that captures where we are right now. I don't think that we've seen the dramatic levels of change that that many are reflecting on right now. I think we are in this interregnum, if you will, where some of the things that people are expressing and articulating as fundamental shifts haven't quite materialized in the ways that we think of. And so I guess my comments are a little bit more sort of at the meta level in terms of thinking about change and thinking about order. And we talk about October 7 as being emblematic of a sort of a shift, a moment in which the regional politics, or the politics of the region, shifted dramatically, akin to 9/11, 1979, etc. But again, I'm not entirely sure that is entirely appropriate. We've seen patterns of behavior change, sure, but have we seen the nature of regional order change? Well, yes and no. We did a book recently. Mark Lynch and I edited a book on regional order, and there was a wonderful chapter in it written by Raffaele Del Sarto and Eduard Soler Lecce, who talked about different types of change and the granularity of change, drawing a distinction between change in something and change of something. And I think that's really apt and really appropriate for where we are right now, in that there has certainly been a change in the rhythms and the patterns of regional order since October 7, and perhaps even more so in the past month or so. But have we seen the emergence of a new order? Well, I don't think we're quite there yet. I think we're still in this interregnum. So what are the patterns then? Well, if we go back across the past decade, we can see a number of different types of patterns, a number of different clusters of security issues. There's, of course, the Arab-Iranian issue that Iyad talked about, that Lena's talked about, that was seemingly being addressed with all of the work that a number of different organizations were doing on Track 2 initiatives that eventually got over the line with the Chinese-mediated Beijing agreement, the normalization agreement between the Saudis and the Iranians that brought to an end a very frosty, fraught, difficult period in relations between the two sides of the Gulf. And I think that agreement ushered in a new period of pragmatic engagement between the two erstwhile rivals. And I must give a shout out to Iyad and a former colleague of ours, Samira Nazirzadeh in Tehran, who wrote a wonderful piece as a Saudi and an Iranian scholar about the need for a pragmatic realignment that came out a good number of years before the normalization agreement was signed. And that points to the broader pragmatic shift there. So we're seeing a shift. Whether we see the full recalibration and a formal sort of rapprochement, I don't think we're there yet either, but that suggests that we're seeing a change in order. Then I guess we've got the Arab-Israeli question. We've seen the Abraham Accords, we've seen talk of normalization. October 7 seemed to press pause on that. Talking to Saudi friends who've been involved in some of the Track 2 initiatives with Israelis, there's been a growing frustration, particularly after October 7 and as the months progressed, that Israeli colleagues weren't listening to Saudi objectives and Saudi visions for what the future should look like. And a real sense of frustration started to emerge there that one friend used the term gaslighting for how they felt they were, their opinions were being heard or indeed not heard. So I think there's a tension starting to emerge there. I'm not sure that there's a dramatic change of order there, but we've definitely not seen the normalization between the Saudis, the Iranians, the Qataris, the Saudis and the Israelis, the Qataris and the Israelis, for example, as well, that people were certainly hoping for. Then I guess the other type of cluster that we're starting to see is the relationship between regional states and global powers. And in particular, the Saudis and the Americans, and the Israelis and the Americans. And Clive is far better qualified than me to talk about the Israeli-American relationship, so I'll leave that there. But I'll just point people to Trump's Truth Social comments in the wake of the ceasefire and the breaches that happened very, very quickly afterwards, and his somewhat incendiary remarks before boarding Air Force One to go to the NATO summit, which point to a frustration predominantly directed at Benjamin Netanyahu, I think, rather than the Iranians. But I think the Saudi relationship with the US, and please, Iyad, correct me here, but I think there's a tension there. I remember sitting in a discussion with some Saudi colleagues and a European ambassador, and we had a discussion about who the Saudis might want to be the next US president. And this was back in November, before Trump won. And there was a real divide, in the sense that Trump was obviously pro-Saudi in the previous, his first term, and pro-business. He was pragmatic. You could, quote unquote, do a deal with him. But Kamala Harris was more predictable. And the shifts that we'd seen in the Saudi decision-making processes, the shifts in the royal court, pointed to a more pragmatic turn. So I think there's a bit of a frustration there. So we're starting to see changing patterns, but not necessarily change in the very nature of order. Now, if the Iranian regime were to fall, there are question marks as to what would happen then, of course. That could potentially lead to a dramatic shift in order. But would that involve tearing up all of the fundamental characteristics and patterns that had made the region what it is today? Well, I guess that depends on what emerges in the aftermath of it. I guess the two final points, and then I'll quickly wrap up. One is the point about Qatar, which has obviously got a really significant role to play. It was, quote unquote, attacked by the Iranians with a bit of coordination with the US and Doha, of course. But it's also played a prominent role in trying to negotiate between the Israelis and Hamas. And yet there was an opinion piece in the Times of Israel a couple of weeks ago, I believe, that pointed to Qatar as being the next target in Israel's efforts to redraw the region. And this was a rather strange opinion piece, and I don't think it was emblematic of anything official, but it pointed to the somewhat complex role that Qatar has to play in the region. And then the final point is the rules-based global order. And I think that is perhaps the area where we've seen the biggest change post-October 7, where the idea that international politics is predicated on a set of norms, rules that had been foundational since the end of the Second World War seems to be coming to an end. And if that is the case, that is perhaps emblematic of a far bigger shift in global politics, which will have serious reverberations across the region. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon, for providing those broader reflections on how things are shifting or not shifting in the ways that we might think, and what that could mean for the future. We've got around sort of 20 to 25 minutes for audience Q&A. So as I've said, please do send any questions you have into the chat box. I might use chair's privilege just to sort of ask perhaps not an official question, but something that maybe you could keep in mind throughout your remarks. Is we've touched briefly on, Simon, thanks for bringing in sort of the role of the US, but I think thinking more about, as you said, Simon, I think that some of the predictions that were had about Trump and the role he might play in the region are changing. So, is Trump going to be the sort of peacemaker in the region that he so often says Simon, I can see your reaction, that he so often says he might want to be? That would be something I'd be grateful for kind of reflections on. But also, what is the role of the UK, if there is one? How should the UK be tailoring its foreign policy towards the region at this time? And I think, especially within the context of the UK government's focus on growth and developing trade partnerships with countries, including, always the kind of ongoing discussion of a free trade agreement with the GCC. So if you were able to touch on those kind of points, that would be great. But maybe I'll turn to a first question that we've had from Michael Harari, who's asked Lena in particular, how could we take advantage of this opportunity after the blow to Iran, whether that would be in terms of with relation to the Palestinian conflict or Syria or a sort of regional security architecture. I think kind of, touching on what those kind of opportunities might lead to. Thanks.
Right. Am I meant to start?
If that's okay, yeah, you can touch on all of these points I've thrown out there.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question on what the opportunities are. The sequencing. First, Iran weakened even if the regime is still there. Let's not forget the lessons from Syria. Just because a regime is still there doesn't mean it's business as usual. So the lesson is, don't look from the top down, look at what's happening inside. So I think with Iran weakened, this opens up the possibility for restarting the peace process on Israel-Palestine. And no matter how much anyone spins it, there can never be any form of stability in this region if the Israel-Palestine issue remains unresolved. It's a fundamental issue. And again, it's one of those conflicts that had been regarded as a conflict we can live with in the international community. So for me, one of the opportunities happening now is being able to restart the peace process. And this relates to what Clive was talking about regarding a possible cabinet reshuffle in Israel. I think there's two possibilities for Netanyahu. Either he reshuffles, gets rid of Ben Gvir and Smotrich, and then agrees to start this peace process, discussions again, or most likely he could be ousted in the next election in Israel. And only Washington, I think, can really influence this restart. So that is one big opportunity. Related to this is the opportunity presented by Syria. Syria is very keen to have stable relations with its neighbors. This is a fundamental change from the days of the Assad regime that was also a destabilizer in the region. With Syria wanting to have reconstruction money flowing into the country, it has to play by the rules that are now being set by the United States, but also by regional countries, namely in the Gulf. And so far, the signs are positive in Syria in that regard. So I would say there's possibilities there once the Israel-Palestine peace process happens, and this will most likely encourage further normalization between Israel and Arab countries. This will in turn encourage the flow of funding to places like Lebanon and Syria for reconstruction, which of course could only be good news for these countries economically, but also will help with stability. And having a stable region is very much in the interest of countries in the Gulf as well, because they don't want to just be prosperous while having a region around them presenting all kinds of risk. And so I feel that the region has a real possibility for an integrated economic and security and political partnership. Now, of course, this is not going to happen in a linear fashion or quickly, but I think that the opportunities are beginning to emerge. And now I feel, and this relates to UK policy as well as more internationally, now's the time for the international community to take a different approach towards this region, which is very different from conflict management, very different from treating these existing leaders in the region, such as in places like Iran, as being taken for granted in terms of their longevity. I think the UK in particular should start thinking seriously about a post-Islamic Republic Iran, for example. And so we need to think long-term, and we need to nurture these opportunities when it comes to politics, security, and the economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina, for responding to the question, and also touching on the kind of the UK's role and other international actors. We've had some more questions coming in, and one that I think would be quite interesting for you, Iyad, to touch on was from Louise Kettle, who said, how have recent events complicated relations for Arab states who are trying to balance, tentatively in some cases, diplomatic relations between both Iran and Israel?
That's a very interesting question. I think the GCC countries are working in coherent together to try to approach Iran diplomatically, meanwhile also approach Israel diplomatically. And that role is the approaching Israel part is hugely done by the UAE and Bahrain. However, since October the 7th, 2023, there wasn't much communication, be it on the public level, at least from between the Israelis and the UAE and the Bahrainis. However, we know of discussions that are not published or not obvious on the public level between the three countries. Surely the Chinese brokered agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran helped the GCC country to navigate what is going on right now and in the past few years between Iran and Israel. Imagine without such an agreement taking place, how the GCC countries would find themselves in which position, a position of taking sides with Israel against the Arab public or against their own public, or a position in which they also take side with Iran against whoever country in the region. That would be a problematizing position for all the GCC countries. So surely it helped, taking that position helped the GCC country to navigate the region. And also I relate this, if you may, Alice, to Dr. Abdullah Sabah question that he disagreed with me. There is no vision in the regional system, especially in the GCC countries. The Saudis are reapproaching with Iran, and it was evidence in the 12 days war. I think there is a clear approach, especially when it comes to regional issues from the GCC countries. We've seen the re-establishment or the normalization of the Saudi-Iranian relationship. The UAE took that step before Saudi Arabia. Also, Bahrain followed Saudi Arabia. We've seen the same took place with Turkey when the GCC countries, or at least Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the UAE rewarmed their relationship with Turkey. So I don't think there is no vision from the GCC countries. There might be a movement towards a unified vision in foreign policies for the GCC countries. However, the regional situation does not really help much to unify visions regarding foreign relations for the GCC countries. I'll leave it at there.
Thank you, Iyad, for touching on that point. That's really helpful. And perhaps when we have a next round of questions, it would be great if you could touch on the kind of the UK approach toward the GCC and how that's playing out too. Clive, there's a question that's come in the chat about the Abraham Accords, and I think it would be good if you could touch on this, given your kind of initial comments. It was, what was the initial intention of the Abraham Accords? And the question here said, was it about undermining the Palestinians' negotiating position? I think this is a conversation that's been had a lot around the idea of, the Palestinians being sort of left behind by the Abraham Accord process. But I think it'd be great if you could touch on some of that, given what you said about, how the Abraham Accords are being viewed now and what their role might be.
Sure. I think that the premise of the Abraham Accords was actually, you can trace the genesis of this actually almost back to sort of the aftermath of the Israel-Lebanon war in 2006. But effectively, it was to create a security network with like-minded Gulf monarchies, but particularly the Emiratis. And I think this comes on the back, particularly between 2018 and 2021, on the wider view that there was a retrenchment of the United States from across the region. So it was very much seen as a security pact, an exchange of intelligence and so forth. And I think this sort of reached its apogee I think it was the spring of 2021 in the so-called Negev summit, when you actually had the foreign ministers of Israel, of the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and so forth, reaching an agreement on security cooperation and exchange. Now, we don't know the full details of actually what was agreed then, but I think this was part and parcel of this sort of creating this kind of wider network in the face of what many perceive to be America's slow pivot away from the Middle East and towards East Asia itself. One shouldn't forget, of course, that I think many in the Gulf were quite shocked by the first Trump administration's reticence to get involved in their defense when they were attacked by Houthi drones and so forth, aimed at their oil facilities in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. So it very much was a security pact, backed up, of course, by increasing means and modes of economic exchange, particularly between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. And we did see a huge growth, for example, in Emirati investment in a whole range of projects under the umbrella of the Abraham Accords itself. But I think what has changed, and I said this in my comments, what has changed is that Israel has now a demonstrated capability to be able to deal with Iran, to hit Iran without the backup, if so to speak, the insurance of the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, and behind the scenes, the Saudis as well. There was a great deal of talk when we had the first missile exchanges between Iran and Israel back in April of 2024 and last October, of the types of early warning that were coming from the Gulf states. But the actual ability to deal physically with Iran, Israel has now demonstrated that capability. But I also think one other thing that it's done, it's demonstrated to the Israelis that ultimately their main guarantor reverts back to the United States of America, that the relationship with Trump, with this administration, prior to that with the Biden administration, but now with the Trump administration, is absolutely pivotal to how Israel now views its security environment. And I think that's where we are with the Abraham Accords. Of course, Israel wants other states to join the Abraham Accords because it's a stamp of approval for Israel's legitimacy within the Middle East. But Netanyahu always saw the Abraham Accords as an outside-in approach. You get effectively the support of other Arab states, particularly the Gulf states, and then you deal with the Palestinians from a position of strength. The problem, however, is that October the 7th challenged that view and challenged that view fundamentally to the point now where most Arab Gulf states, the Saudis in particular, are saying there has to be meaningful progress, tangible progress towards a two-state solution and Israel recognizing the rights of the Palestinian people. Until that is officially recognized by Israel, then the Saudis will not become part of the Abraham Accords process.
Thank you, Clive. Yeah, and I see your hand raised, so please do come in.
A very small and fast point regarding normalization with Israel. There is an interesting element that most of the people don't look at when it comes to Saudi Arabia or the GCC in general and normalization with Israel. There is a huge gap in the balance of power. I'm talking the military one, the material balance of power, and it is evident more than ever after October the 7th, 2023. So I wouldn't only think about the Palestinian issue when it comes to normalization, but also to the huge advantage of Israel's strong hand in the Middle East, backed up by the West when it comes to Saudi calculations for normalization with Israel. That's the only point.
Thanks, Iyad and Clive. I see your hand is up too.
Yeah, just one final point to add to what I've said. The fact that the Saudis right now won't engage with the Abraham process doesn't, of course, mean that they're not engaging with Israel. I mean, one thing that I think that we need to note is that Israel has always been able, through covert diplomacy, to actually engage with most of the Middle East itself. I've written about this elsewhere, and I call it a tacit security regime. But I think Israel would be quite happy to revert to that particular type if by engaging in the Abraham Accords and then having to make meaningful concessions, which they now would regard as red lines, that would be the price. So I think Israel would be quite happy to go back to old practices if it still kept channels of communication open covertly, but without having to pay an overt diplomatic price.
Thank you, Clive. Yeah, that's really interesting, and thanks, Iyad, as well for coming in. Simon, just based kind of building on your kind of reflections on the future and what's changed and what actually hasn't and how this might move forward. There's a question in the chat here about, do you feel that improved relations between Gulf countries and Iran helped to stop the recent Iran-Israel conflict from escalating further? And Jonathan Lesser, who asked this question, has said, for now. And if those better relations continue, do you think that'll affect overall regional security moving forward?
Yeah, thank you. For a book that I was writing a while ago, I went through some of the WikiLeaks material and found a really interesting conversation documented between King Hamad of Bahrain and the US ambassador. This was in 2007, and the king said to the US ambassador, look, we are ready to normalize with Israel. We want to normalize with Israel. It took 13 years for them to do it, but they said in 2007 that they were ready to do it. Now, that would have been at a time that would have been really difficult to do and to pull off. Domestically, the landscape of the region was dramatically different, but it shows you, I think, the evolution of threat perceptions here. It shows you the centrality of Iran in some of the strategic threat perceptions of Gulf states, but that has started to ebb. I would argue it started to diminish, and in response to the question, I think there's something to be said that rapprochement, that normalization, that reintegration of Iran into the Persian Gulf security complex, or the Gulf sub-regional complex, however you want to call it, has played a really prominent role in preventing this from getting out of hand, because he had put it very eloquently earlier on that if this had happened a couple of years ago before the Beijing mediated agreement, could very easily have seen this get out of hand and escalate far, far more. But I think it also speaks to something that Clive was talking about with the Israeli case of the Abraham Accords. And if I get this right, Clive, you were saying that Netanyahu viewed it as a sort of outside-in approach. But I think for the Gulf states, this is more of an inside-out approach, the sense of trying to build a regional security architecture from the inside that is inclusive. Because some of the key dividing lines in the past had been about how regional security was constructed. The role of outside players, the Saudis, the Emiratis, for example, had been reliant on the US as a guarantor of security, much to the chagrin of the Iranians. But finding a way of creating a regional security architecture from the inside that then looked outwards, I think was seen to be a more pragmatic and more sustainable way of building a longer term form of prosperity that spoke to Vision 2030, that spoke to the economic pragmatism of the Arab Gulf states, and that spoke to the economic needs of the Iranians for their injection of capital into various domestic industries and infrastructure. So yeah, I guess that would be my response, that it has played a significant role, but that it speaks to a broader shift in the ways in which leaders across the Gulf had been thinking about ways and possible ways of doing security that weren't just governed by short-term reliance on external powers, but was more sort of longer term and strategic. And this became particularly evident when there was the realization that they couldn't rely on Trump to protect them when the Houthi attacks took place in 2018, 2019. So yeah, I think it's the inside out that has actually played a really important role here in preventing a larger escalation.
Thank you, Simon, for those reflections. We have sort of like 4 minutes left before I'll do a very, very quick wrap up. So I wanted to turn to each speaker. There's still quite a few questions in the chat box, which unfortunately I don't think we'll get to all of them, but thank you to everyone who put them in the chat. We're really grateful. But I did want to go, maybe if I could do a kind of quick run round of go in the order we spoke. So Lena, Iyad, Clive, and then Simon, if you had a sort of 1 minute final remark that you might want to share, or a reflection based on any of the questions that are in the chat, that would be a great way to kind of end and make sure that you can kind of provide your last comments. So Lena, I'll turn to you first for your 1 minute assessment of the Middle East, which I'm sure is an easy task.
This region, again and again, is approached by Western policymakers as a region in which everything is permanent in terms of the power dynamics. And we are now seeing that this is not the case. And this approach that this region is something that can be ignored because ultimately the status quo will prevail, has led to the continuation of suffering across the Middle East. Syria being one case, even Lebanon, the international community really dismissed the pocket of hope that was sparked in 2019, in particular in the country. And it's honestly the Lebanese people who really tried very hard to push their country towards progress that are now resulting in the breakthrough that we are seeing today. And yet the international community remains a bit lukewarm. So I worry that a similar approach may be taken after this initial enthusiasm or attention to what might happen next. And I think, you know, taking this region for granted is the biggest mistake the international community can make.
Thank you, Lena, and yeah, for reflecting on the role of the international community there. Iyad, can I turn to you next for your 1 minute summary?
Sure, very fast. When you look at the GCC relations with Iran, you have a bit of a hopeful picture of the region. Also, when you look at on the GCC relations with Turkey, even with Russia and China, who were not necessarily 30 or 40 years ago, had very good relationships with the GCC countries, right, as they do right now. So that's a hopeful picture. But when you look at the other side of it, you'll see a diminished regional order, an extended hand of sub-state actors, and also you'll see the Israeli hand, which is trying to solve all of this with material power. So you have two sides of the coin, and it's right now we live in the moment where one of the sides of the coin must prevail at the end. I don't think there is much of a Western helping hand when it comes to solving this issue in the Middle East or solving the regional scene as we see right now. I hope that Western actors will have more strategic outlook of the region rather than a tactical one, which is using the region to solve issues with China or Russia or what have you. That's my only point. Thank you.
Thank you, Iyad. And yeah, Clive, I could come to you for some very brief remarks.
Yeah, I mean, many years ago, I think, the great Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban once noted that the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And I fear his words actually have an echo now for where Israel is. At the end of the Six-Day War, Israel had immense territorial gains which they could have leveraged for diplomatic gain. Right now, Israel has huge military gains. It's scored a huge, whether we like it or not, it's scored a huge win against Iran. It's diminished Iran, I think, within the eyes of many across much of the Middle East and North Africa. But the challenge for Israel now is how you actually cash in those military gains for diplomatic advantage. I think Israel is actually missing a huge opportunity, for example, in not engaging more proactively with the new regime in Syria, although Gideon Saar recently has spoken about perhaps the Syrians could join the Abraham Accords, but just joining the Abraham Accords without any kind of quid pro quo from Israel is simply not going to happen. So I think the challenge really for Israel is what do you do with these military gains, and purely therefore reliance upon, as I had just mentioned, the preponderance it has in its arsenal, its military superiority simply won't be enough to effectively secure long-term security for Israel going forward.
Thank you, Clive. And yeah, with 1 minute to go, Simon, could I ask you for sort of 30 seconds perhaps of comments if possible?
Thanks, Alice. Yeah, so I guess I'll go back to the great Ibn Khaldun, the Arab philosopher, who talks about politics being about the survival of the species. It's about people. And I fear that amidst these grand machinations of elites across the world, it's people that are being marginalized. People are being affected by bombing. People are being affected by conflict. People are being affected by terror across the region. We're seeing increased violence in Syria. We're seeing bombing for peace in Iran. We're seeing all of these horrors in Gaza. We're seeing the fears that Israelis are having to live with about terror attacks. We're seeing socioeconomic destruction of Lebanon. The list goes on. Bombing of Yemen, the destruction of Yemen. That's where I think the UK and indeed others have to follow this idea of adhering to global norms, global laws, and really uphold their obligations to the foundations of a global order that emerged out of the horrors of the Second World War to try and prevent future horrors.
Thank you, Simon, for that final note. And yeah, thank you very much. So to Simon, Lena, Iyad, and Clive for sharing your insights today. It's been a broad and fascinating discussion, and we're very grateful at the Foreign Policy Centre for your time. And thank you also to the SEPAD project for co-hosting as part of our ongoing partnership. We'll be covering more in the Middle East through our ongoing work with the SEPAD project, so please do look out for future events and activities through that partnership, but also more broadly at the Foreign Policy Centre by signing up to our mailing list. And thank you all for joining and sharing your questions throughout. We'll be sharing a very short post-event survey, and we'll be very grateful for your feedback through this as well. But thank you again to all of our speakers, and thanks again for joining.